Hi, I'm Ken Burns. You probably already know me from my Civil War documentaries or my overplaying of the song A Soakin' Farewell. Anyway, today we will be examining
Gods of War.
Thomas Jackson was born on January 21st, 1824, in Clarksburg, Virginia. He had a typical childhood and attended college at West Point, where he graduated in 1846. He served as a second lieutenant in the Mexican-American War, later to be promoted to first lieutenant. In 1851, he became a professor at VMI until the war broke out, and President Davis promoted him to a brigadier general of the Confederate Army.
It was at Bull Run that Jackson proved himself such a tenacious leader. The Confederate soldiers insisted on retreating, but he demanded otherwise. Because of this, the Confederates won the battle, and he was christened with the nickname Stonewall Jackson.
Jackson was known to be very secretive about his plans, informing his subordinates just before the battle so that there was little chance of intel being given to the enemy. He also had such a good understanding of Lee that he was sometimes able to know what he wanted to do without even speaking to him.
Jackson had such a good understanding of Lee that he was sometimes able to know what he wanted to do without even speaking to him. This partnership was at its best during Chancellorsville. Jackson executed Lee's plan to perfection, and the Confederacy won the battle because of it. His loss would prove fatal at Gettysburg.
Chancellorsville is the greatest example of Lee and Jackson's partnership. Despite the fact that Hooker's army vastly outnumbered the Confederacy, the two Southern generals were able to emerge victorious through superior tactics. Jackson's performance at Chancellorsville exemplified his tenacity as well as his remarkable discipline. However, it was he and Lee's will that take the risks that ultimately won the battle. Unfortunately for the Confederacy, as Jackson was returning to camp from a day of battle at Chancellorsville, he was mistaken for a Union officer and fired upon by his own men. His arm had to be amputated, and Jackson began to grow weak. After a little over a week, Jackson succumbed to pneumonia and fell into a state of delirium. After a few hours, he uttered his last words.
"Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." Thomas Jackson.
William Tecumseh Sherman, our second God of War, was born in Lancaster, Ohio on February 8, 1820. He lived in a typical home until his father died at age 9. His mother, unable to support all 12 kids, had to split the family and send Sherman to live with Sir Thomas Ewing, a family friend. Here, Sherman was well taken care of and sent to the prestigious military academy at West Point, where he performed quite modestly. He graduated and served in the Second Seminole War in 1840. Following the war, Sherman tried many different professions, including teaching, law, and business, but was never as satisfied as he was on the battlefield. Once the war broke out, Sherman rejoined the army and was commissioned as a colonel. He saw action at Bull Run and was promoted to brigadier general following the battle after Lincoln saw his abilities. Over the course of the next few battles, Sherman began to struggle mentally. His history of mental breakdowns and anxiety came back to haunt him, and the press labeled him insane. Sherman, however, would eventually overcome these disabilities and continue his career.
Sherman had always wanted to serve under Grant, and he finally got his chance at the Battle of Shiloh. After a surprise attack by the Confederates, Sherman rallied the panicked men to defend their posts and hold the area. It was because of this brave move by Sherman that the Union was able to stand strong, until General Grant was able to rally the troops once more and finally defeat the rebel forces.
After witnessing the sheer carnage at Shiloh, Sherman knew that someone had to come up with an alternative to the extensive violence. This would promote him to create a type of indirect warfare, which is witnessed at the destruction of Atlanta and obnoxious.
Continued to be successful at Chattanooga, Vicksburg, and eventually Atlanta, where he would have his true claim to fame. Sherman and his troops swept down through Georgia and destroyed everything in their path, all the way to the coast at Savannah. This would be the final blow to Southern infrastructure and ultimately leave the South crippled and starving. Sherman led a small campaign in North Carolina following the march, but it wasn't long before a surrender was arranged, and Sherman and Confederate General Joseph Johnston met to discuss the terms for ending the great conflict. Sherman had truly become a god of war. Robert E. Lee was born January 19, 1807, at Stratford Hall Plantation in Westmoreland County, Virginia, to Major General Henry Lee III, the Governor of Virginia. Always strong in academics, Lee entered West Point in 1825 and graduated second in his class and entered the Army Corps as a second lieutenant. Lee distinguished himself in the Mexican-American War, and by the end of the war had been promoted to the rank of colonel.
What most people don't realize is that Lee was actually against secession. He was offered multiple command positions in the Confederacy, but declined all. It wasn't until Virginia finally seceded that he felt the need to abandon the Union for his home state.
Despite his first battle being a loss, Lee by 1862 would be appointed by President Davis as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. The reason for this was his luck quickly turned around with a major strategic victory in the 7 Days Battles, where he proved his tactical prowess by forcing McClellan to retreat all the way back to the Union territory after plunging deep into Virginia in his Peninsula campaign. Arguably, Lee's most impressive victory was at Chancellorsville. He proved his aggressiveness here by splitting his already outnumbered forces, still managing to inflict major losses upon the Union Army. But his victory would be short-lived. After Jackson's death, Lee and the Army as a whole were never the same.
He lost his left arm, and I lost my right. Robert E. Lee.
Lee was a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield. A cunning leader, he was referred to by many as the Gray Fox. His ability to outdo his opponents and predict their actions came from reading Northern newspaper and determining Northern opinions on battles before they occurred. From this, he could learn the state of morale of the Union people and decide if an attack was practical at any given time.
Lee, as well as his army, had finally reached their breaking point at Appomattox, where he surrendered to Grant. The two men, both tired from a long day of battle, shared stories of their experiences on the battlefield, came to fair terms for Lee's men, and proceeded to go their separate ways. Had it not been for Lee's valiant efforts, the South likely would have fallen sooner. His fierce loyalty to his home state of Virginia, and his ability to stand in the face of impossible odds, made him one of the greatest military masterminds the world has ever seen.
It is well that war is so terrible, lest we should grow too fond of it. Robert E. Lee.
Born in 1822 in the quiet town of Point Pleasant, Ohio, Hiram Ulysses Grant was an unusual child. He often kept to himself and made few close friends. He continued this lifestyle into his college years at West Point, where he graduated in the middle of his class and quickly moved out onto the battlefield in the heat of the Mexican War. Here he served under many famous generals like Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor. He performed quite well during his time of duty, but the war ended before he could reach his true potential. With nowhere to fight, Grant fell into a financial crisis that brought on depression and a terrible drinking addiction. He faded into obscurity and began working odd jobs around St. Louis. It wouldn't be until the outbreak of the Civil War that Grant would move on and be in the battlefield again, where he quickly moved up the ranks and gained much notoriety. It wouldn't be until Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, however, that Grant would reach his full potential. After crushing the Confederate forces at these two battles, Grant earned the nickname Unconditional Surrender. Grant, due to his no negotiation policy on surrender.
No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. Ulysses S. Grant.
Grant continued his victory streak at Chattanooga and the famous Siege of Vicksburg, where the Mississippi was put back under federal control after a brutal 2-month blockade by Grant and the Union troops. These victories would skyrocket Grant into military fame and earn him the respect of his troops.
Grant's actions at Vicksburg were probably some of the most important of the war. The town was a gateway to the Mississippi and essentially to the entire Deep South, and by laying siege to it, he now had complete access to the river.
After repeated successes, Lincoln realized Grant, with his determination, was the man for the job and promoted him to commander of all armed forces in the Union, including the Army of the Potomac.
Grant was a man who wasn't afraid to do what needed to be done. Unlike McClellan and all the other head generals before him, Grant wasn't above sending his men into a deadly fight if he knew that victory was possible. This trait is probably what Lincoln liked best about him.
His actions at these battles would skyrocket him into military fame, as well as earn him the respect of his troops. The South, at this point, was on its last leg. Sherman had completed his march to the sea, and supplies were almost non-existent for the remaining Confederates. Grant knew that the time to strike was now. He overpowered Lee's troops at Appomattox and could tell the end was near. Lee, who knew it just as well as Grant, requested a meeting place to surrender. A local courthouse was settled upon, and the two gods of war met to discuss their terms.
Get it, get it, get it.
Kill, kill, kill.
Crocodile Hunter, Daniel Sawyer.
Crikey. The size of it.
No, you sick freak. This is abuse.
What's his name?